On August 7, 1992, a loving wife was abducted from her home. It happened in the small town of Itz in the state of Tennessee. The residents were very frightened, and her family was inconsolable. The FBI tried to outsmart the kidnapper, but the only clue they had was a ransom call. The unknown caller phoned the victim's husband and said he would cut off his wife's head if his demands were not met. Itz is a small community located about a half-hour's drive from Memphis. In 1992, around 500 or 600 people lived there, fewer do today. It was basically a rural area where everyone knew everyone else, and there was virtually no crime. When the incident occurred on August 7, 1992, the locals could not believe it. Martha Doe Roberts married Alan Roberts in 1948. They had no children but owned several successful businesses in Memphis. They sold everything, bought 60 acres of land in Itz, built a house there, and lived quietly and peacefully. They were a wonderful couple as far as their relationship went. They seemed made for each other. Martha was very kind and always tried to help anyone she could. On that day, Friday, August 7, Alan had no idea it would become a nightmare. He had an appointment to show one of his houses to a potential buyer. He drove over at 10 a.m. to meet the prospective buyer and was cleaning up the house to make it look more presentable. But the person he was expecting never showed up. Around 6:30 p.m., Alan finished working and went back home. He immediately noticed the garage door was open, even though the car was parked inside, and Martha's car was next to it, which was suspicious. He went inside and began looking for his wife, but she was nowhere to be found. When he saw Martha's inhaler on the kitchen table, he began to panic. She was asthmatic and had already been hospitalized several times. Martha could not live without her medication, so Alan was terrified. It was almost evening. He started calling friends and acquaintances, not knowing where his wife had gone. He decided to call the police, but there was no time. Shocking news was about to reach him. That evening, Alan received a call from the kidnapper, who threatened to kill Martha if Alan did not meet all his demands. The kidnapper then demanded a ransom of $100,000. Alan quickly realized what was going on and switched on the answering machine to record the call. But the kidnapper seemed to be nearby, watching Alan's every move, and ordered him to remove the tape from the answering machine and destroy it. After that, he immediately called the police. A few minutes later, sirens could be heard outside the police and the sheriff had arrived, and the FBI agents came with them. They immediately examined all doors and windows of the house for signs of forced entry but found nothing. There was no sign of a struggle in the house or outside, nothing suspicious. Their first step was to make sure an abduction had really taken place. The officers began questioning Alan, asking about what the kidnapper had said and how he spoke, but Alan fell silent at some point, staring blankly and refusing to speak. Then he tried to describe the call. A man with a foreign accent had phoned him, saying he had Martha and demanding $1,100,000, adding he should not call the police. Yet something about Alan's story made the FBI agents uneasy. It seemed very strange that the kidnapper gave no detailed instructions for delivering the ransom. Normally, kidnappers are very particular about how to get the money, but in this case, the FBI agents could not understand the kidnapper's motive. They began questioning every member of the family to rule them out as suspects. In cases like this, the main suspect is usually someone who has a close relationship with the victim. Since Alan Roberts was the last person to have seen his wife that morning before he left for work, and the only one who had spoken with the kidnapper, the FBI began investigating everything about him, his identity, his life, and his place in society. Meanwhile, the search for Martha continued. Kidnappings were very rare that year, and the abduction in Itz seemed implausible. It was all the more mysterious that nobody understood what had happened to Martha. Alan Roberts, for his part, waited for the kidnapper to call again and name a place where he could bring the $100,000. He had no idea that the FBI had its own suspicions about who the kidnapper was. They knew the primary suspect is almost always someone close to the victim. To test the theory that Alan Roberts might be responsible for the kidnapping, the FBI installed a wiretap. Agents bugged the entire house so they could hear as much as possible. The agents also stayed in the Roberts home in case the kidnapper called again. While Alan and the FBI agents waited for the kidnapper's call, a neighbor reported noticing something suspicious. A white Winnebago van had been driving in and out of the neighborhood. The officers decided they urgently needed to find this vehicle, so they took the highway from West Memphis, Arkansas, to Jackson, Tennessee, and spotted a white delivery van outside a roadside motel. They knocked on the van window and said they needed to search the vehicle. Naturally, the owners were not thrilled but still let them. It turned out they were out-of-towners who had simply gotten lost. They admitted right away they had driven through it by mistake. This lead turned out to be a dead end. Everyone was disheartened that the owners of the white van had nothing to do with Martha's kidnapping, as they wanted nothing more than to bring her back home. Meanwhile, law enforcement officers searched the area around the Roberts home, both from the air with helicopters and on the ground, hoping for any useful clues, but found nothing. The day after Martha's kidnapping, FBI agents continued questioning Alan Roberts about his whereabouts on the day of the abduction. Their suspicion grew, because he had been the last person to see his wife that morning before heading to work. Naturally, he was a suspect. Alan told the FBI that on the day before his wife's kidnapping, he had received a call from a man introducing himself as Sam Wagner from Indiana, saying he wanted to buy a property with a house on it. Martha noticed the man had a strong accent and did not speak well. Now the FBI had a new lead. The kidnapper and the supposed buyer who never showed up to meet Alan both had a strong accent. From that moment on, the FBI began investigating Sam Wagner from Indiana. Who was this man? They needed to find out everything about him. But it turned out there was no Sam Wagner, no such person from Indiana, and certainly no one by that name there who was interested in purchasing land. He was a phantom of sorts. The investigators became even more suspicious of Alan. Several days went by, but the kidnapper did not get in touch again. Alan decided to take action. On Tuesday, he made a statement asking the kidnapper to contact him so he could pay the ransom. 3 days later, when he still had not received a call, he offered a reward. Although the FBI was against it, Alan called a press conference and announced he was prepared to pay anyone who could help him get Martha back. Alan was a wealthy man and could afford a generous $100,000 reward, which was a significant sum. He just wanted his wife back and believed money might persuade anyone who knew of her whereabouts to speak. Time passed, but nothing happened. FBI agents had been working in the Roberts home for days, but since the kidnapper was not contacting them, they had no leads. They left the Roberts house and set up headquarters in it so they could discuss the investigation in peace without worrying about Alan Roberts or anyone in his circle overhearing. Everything the FBI did pointed to Alan being the main suspect until the phone rang again. One evening in early October, Alan's phone rang. It was the kidnapper, speaking with a strong accent. He told Alan to go to a payphone at a specific address. Alan went there immediately and took the kidnapper's call. This time, the kidnapper wanted the $1,185,000 in cash. Everyone hoped that, this time, the kidnapper would finally give instructions on how to deliver the ransom, but that did not happen. He provided no information about the exact time or place to exchange the money for Martha. At this point, the FBI suspected Alan was involved in his wife's kidnapping, because there was still no direct proof that the kidnapper actually existed. Alan, for his part, ignored this suspicion and continued trying to approach the kidnapper through the media. On camera, he did not exactly show his best side. If one didn't know what he was going through and how difficult it was for him, one might have thought he was definitely guilty. Over time, Alan became more and more depressed. He was not crazy, but he was in a terrible mental state, having lost his sense of purpose and not knowing how to go on living. He kept sinking deeper into despair and eventually realized he absolutely needed company. He began inviting women to dinner and to the movies, and going dancing. Naturally, gossip started immediately. Many members of the church congregation, especially women, found this behavior unacceptable. They began saying maybe he had girlfriends and was cheating on Martha. One person said something, another added to it, a third spread it on, and soon the rumors circulated throughout the community. Only a few congregation members and relatives felt that Alan did not need to stay home alone and cut off contact with others. A so-called casserole club emerged, a name Alan himself came up with. It was made up of women who were concerned about him and brought him food. Lines of women would queue up at his house to comfort Alan. These women genuinely cared about him and tried to take care of him, since Martha was not there. But to most onlookers it looked different. He was alone, his wife had been kidnapped, and he was out meeting other women. Naturally, people gossiped, speculated, and discussed his actions and behavior in the local community. Because of all his social activities, the FBI became even more suspicious of him, but it was still too soon to confront him about it. In the winter of 1993, several people in Itz reported being contacted by a man with an accent. One of them was Martha's friend, Melinda Lancaster, who contacted the FBI and said she wanted to approach the kidnapper on Martha's behalf. Melinda asked the kidnapper to tell her where the ransom could be delivered, believing he no longer wanted to communicate with Alan Roberts. She hoped she could lure him out by assuring him he would definitely get the money if he told her where Martha was. However, the caller never gave clear instructions on what to do with the money. Then the kidnapper started calling all the local residents, saying Alan did not care about his wife and only wanted money. The FBI said they would rather speak to the missing woman than to the mysterious kidnapper, that they wanted him to give her a chance to talk to someone who could identify her voice, but this mysterious kidnapper never gave clear instructions or indicated when he would release Martha. All these events terrified the residents of Itz. Imagine you are sitting quietly at home in the evening watching TV, and suddenly the phone rings. A person on the other end claims Alan Roberts is a dirtbag who hired kidnappers himself to abduct his wife, and that Alan refused to pay the ransom. Some local church members started a fundraiser to collect the ransom for Alan's wife. When the kidnapper began calling residents and declaring Alan refused to pay, people started to wonder and discuss the possibility that he really was involved in the abduction. The head of the church, Charles Lord, had been Alan's staunchest supporter, but even he began to have doubts. He revealed that Mr. Roberts and his wife had relationship problems and that Alan had been cheating on her. The FBI immediately focused on Alan again, interrogating him for hours and asking the same questions over and over, to which he gave the same answers. Alan said that at some point, he no longer understood what was going on at all. One day, FBI agents brought in an excavator to the spot where he burned trash, digging a huge hole in hopes of finding something, but there was nothing but garbage. The police could not prove Alan had anything to do with Martha's disappearance, but in the eyes of the public, he was guilty. Everyone believed Alan did it, and it was a real hardship for his family. Alan fell deeper and deeper into depression, and his relatives grew worried. One day, he told his nephew he did not know how long he could go on like this, that he was almost out of strength and wanted it all to end. He did not explicitly say he wanted to die, but after that conversation, his nephew took away his guns so Alan would not harm himself. Then the kidnapper made his next unexpected move. On March 4th, 1993, he called a local TV station. The journalist who answered the phone had a tape recorder on his desk, set it to speakerphone, and recorded the conversation. The kidnapper announced that Alan's wife had died earlier that morning. The journalist tried to keep him talking for as long as possible, hoping to pick up any noise in the background that could provide a clue, but the caller kept repeating the same thing. Martha Roberts is dead. The journalist tried asking how he could be certain, where she was, and how one could get more information. The kidnapper grew angry at all the questions, saying he wanted to talk and not be questioned, and then abruptly hung up. The next day, he called again, but this time claimed Martha was alive, completely changing his story. During the conversation, the reporter asked where the money should be brought, and for the first time in the entire investigation, The kidnapper gave a date and a place. They were to hand over the money at a large nearby shopping center. The kidnapper insisted Alan bring the money himself, but Alan did not want to go alone, so he took his nephew along. They parked outside the shopping mall and waited. Undercover officers were also there, noting all the license plates. This was the critical moment, but the kidnapper never showed up. The next person to hear from the kidnapper was Alan Roberts' neighbor, Charles Lord. He did not receive phone calls. She received letters from a man claiming to have kidnapped Martha and was holding her captive. Since Lord said he started getting letters, the officers set up a surveillance camera in a birdhouse across from the mailbox to see who was dropping them off. But every time someone put letters in the mailbox, the camera somehow stopped working and recorded nothing. The officers were frustrated and felt they had missed a chance to identify Martha Roberts' kidnapper. In the summer of 1993, some of Martha's family members got together to figure out who might be behind the abduction. Martha's nephews, William, Paul, and Larry Knox, were very frustrated that the FBI and the police were not providing any facts. They launched their own investigation. They suspected a certain man and came up with a plan to trap him. The brothers gave the man a phone number known only to the three of them to see if the kidnapper would call that number. It was one of the brothers' numbers, unlisted in the phone book. Sure enough, the next day, the kidnapper called that exact unlisted number. The brothers believed they had found the kidnapper and arranged to meet him at a motel to hand over the ransom. They placed bundles of money on the bed, covered it with a sheet, and waited. 45 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It was Charles Lord. They were already suspicious of him, and seeing him on the doorstep made them almost unable to restrain themselves from grabbing him on the spot. Charles Lord was highly respected in the local Methodist church. Many people in Itz looked up to him. Sensing trouble, he said he was just there to help and asked them to give him the money so he could deliver it to the kidnapper and bring Martha home. The Knox brothers refused. Then Lord made a mistake. The brothers had been given clear instructions from the kidnapper on who should be in the motel room and that the money was to be handed over to their mother. But the brothers decided it was too dangerous for their mother to be there in person. Lord asked them, "Why are you here? This is where your mother should be." They asked how he knew that, since only the kidnapper knew. Charles Lord then lost his temper. There was an argument, and he finally ran out of the motel. The brothers immediately reported him to the FBI. The FBI agents sprang into action, hoping Martha was still alive. Since there was no definitive evidence she had died, they were operating under the assumption that she was alive and doing everything they could to rescue her. Forging documents to get the money. They also analyzed his financial statements and found he had embezzled money from the church, at least $14,000. As it turned out, nobody except the church's bookkeeper had known about it. Then the FBI discovered something interesting. Martha had taken over the church's bookkeeping from Charles Lord. He had not wanted her to uncover his fraud. The FBI confronted Lord with everything they had found, summoned him for questioning, and he immediately confessed to having kidnapped and then murdered Martha. During the interrogation, he described what happened on August 7, 1992, the day Martha went missing, and admitted his motive was money. He had posed as Sam Wagner and scheduled a 10 a.m. meeting with Mr. Roberts, supposedly to discuss a property he wanted to buy. Lord knew Mr. Roberts would not be home, and in order to abduct Mrs. Roberts, he went to her house and told her husband had been in an accident and that she should come with him to the hospital. After she got into his car, he drove her to his house and took her to a room above the garage. He admitted to raping her before suffocating her with a pillow, all while his wife was downstairs. No matter how many times he was asked about his motives, he always insisted he only wanted money. However, at no point did he provide clear instructions about how the ransom should be delivered. Investigators believed Charles Lord wanted to control the investigation by feeding off the chaos in the township. That was his ransom. Still, they did not know where Martha Roberts' body was and were determined to find out. Lord told them he had thrown her body in the river, so divers searched all day for Martha's remains and her personal belongings but found nothing. The FBI agents then realized he had not disposed of the body in the river and had made the whole thing up. They spoke with his lawyers, and the lawyers said they were tired of Charles Lord's endless game. Shea would have to tell the truth if he wanted a lighter sentence. The lawyers drafted an agreement stating that if Lord revealed where he had hidden Martha's body and pleaded guilty, the state would not seek the death penalty. Finally, he confessed. He had buried Martha Roberts' body in his backyard on the night of her abduction. He had dug the grave weeks before the crime. He placed Martha's body beneath a fresh compost pile, then covered the spot with lime and poured concrete over it. When the police dug it up, they discovered the body was well preserved, with her hands raised toward her face, suggesting she was still alive when he buried her. On September 16, 1993, Charles Lord was found guilty of first-degree murder and rape. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years for rape. After living for a year under suspicion of having murdered his beloved wife, Alan Roberts was finally exonerated. He decided to move away. After Charles Lord was convicted, Alan returned to the local Methodist church and spoke plainly, expressing how angry and disappointed he was that everyone had turned against him. He asked that his name be removed from the church roll, then turned around and walked out, never to return. Alan left ITS in 1994 and married Esther Hemmons, one of the dance partners he had met after Martha's disappearance. He lived the rest of his life happily and in peace. Charles Lord, on the other hand, spent the rest of his life in prison, where he later died. In other words, justice was served. Thank you for watching, and please take care of yourselves.